The wagon wheels groaned as they sank into the dirt, the last light of dusk painting the prairie in copper and ash. Clara sat stiff beside her father, her hands clenched around the frayed ends of her mother's shawl. When the wagon jolted to a halt, the dust rose and clung to her throat, bitter as betrayal. Without a word, her father climbed down, gave a short nod toward the man waiting by the weather-beaten house, and then turned back to the reins. His face was already turned away as the horses pulled forward, the rattle of the wagon wheels fading into the vast emptiness of the plains. She stood alone now, a small figure before the stranger who was meant to be her keeper. Jonas Hale, his name she had overheard once whispered in town like something heavy. He was taller than she expected, with shoulders hardened by years of toil, his beard touched with silver that caught the dying light. His eyes studied her not with hunger, nor with welcome, but with the kind of guarded silence that comes from long grief. Behind his leg, half hidden in the doorway, a little girl peeked out, clutching a rag doll tight to her chest. Clara offered a tentative smile, but the child ducked back into the shadows. Jonas didn't speak right away. The wind filled the silence, whispering through the dry grass, carrying with it the loneliness of miles. At last he jerked his chin toward the porch. "Best come inside. Supper's gone cold." His voice was low, steady, without warmth. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and stale coffee. Clara's fingers brushed the surface of the rough-hewn table, its wood scarred by years of meals, perhaps arguments, perhaps silence. A single chair rocked gently in the corner as if still haunted by someone who used to sit there. On the wall hung a rifle, polished and ready, and beside it a faded shawl, one that had once belonged to another woman. Jonas gestured toward a small room at the back, its door hanging slightly askew. Within, Clara found a narrow bed, a basin, and nothing else. Clean, but bare, as though it were a space meant for a ghost rather than a living soul. She set her small bag on the floor and lingered, the quiet pressing against her ears. When he spoke again, his words were as spare as the room. "You'll work. I won't ask for more." He left her there, his boots sounding heavy on the floorboards, as he retreated to the main room. Clara sank onto the bed, the straw-stuffed mattress whispering beneath her weight. Her father's absence felt like a raw wound, yet she did not cry. Instead, she sat still, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, eyes tracing the cracks in the wooden walls. She was not beaten. Not yet. There was something in Jonas's silence, a weight that was not cruelty but restraint, like a man who had sworn never to ask for more than the world would give. That night, lying awake with the distant sound of the rocking chair creaking in the other room, Clara felt the coldness of her new life settling over her. Yet beneath it flickered something faint and stubborn, the smallest ember of dignity that even her father's trade could not strip away. The days fell into a rhythm, though not a gentle one. Clara rose before the sun, the prairie wind cold against her face as she carried pails of water from the well. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles ached, boiled shirts stiff with old sweat, and swept dust that seemed to seep endlessly through cracks in the walls. Outside, the livestock shifted and lowed beneath skies so wide they made her feel small, as if she might be swallowed whole by the horizon if she dared look too long. She moved quietly through her tasks, never once hearing her father's name on Jonas's lips, never once receiving a word that might tell her she was anything but necessary labor. Jonas said little. His words were counted, measured, like a man wary of spending too much of himself. The lines on his face carried the weight of years and losses she could only guess at. His hands, though strong, bore the scars of work that never ended, of a fight against the land that was as much survival as it was duty. In the evenings, when he sat in his rocking chair and stared into the flames, Clara would glance at the portrait on the wall, the face of a woman who looked at once kind and unreachable. His wife, she realized, the one who had walked through this house before her, whose presence lingered in every quiet corner. Clara studied that face in the dim glow of lamplight and wondered whether Jonas's silence was simply because she was not her. Was she a ghost's poor imitation, brought here only to fill a hollow chair? Jonas, though he said little, saw more than Clara imagined. He watched her from a distance, the way her braid swung against her back as she bent to draw water, the raw red of her hands as she chopped wood too heavy for her slight frame. He noticed the flinch she could not hide when riders passed along the trail, men whose laughter carried with it the roughness of memory. She wore her silence like armor, and he recognized it, for he wore the same. It was Ruth, small and watchful, who bridged the distance between them. At first the child lingered in corners, peeking from behind skirts or furniture, her doll clutched so tightly its stuffing threatened to spill. But slowly, she inched closer. She tugged at Clara's shawl, wide eyes asking without words for something. First, and one night, when the wind keened against the shutters, Ruth pressed a tattered Bible into Clara's hands. Clara hesitated, then read aloud, her voice soft, carrying halting words into the hush of the room. Jonas sat in the shadows, unmoving, listening. The girl leaned against Clara's side, eyes fluttering shut, as if she had always belonged there. But shadows clung to them both. Jonas found himself hearing laughter where there was none, remembering the scent of bread baking in the oven, a hand once resting lightly on his arm. The absence of his wife was a wound that refused to close. For Clara, memory brought a different ache, the sound of her father's voice trading her away with the same tone he might have used for cattle. The back of his shoulders as he drove the wagon into the distance, never looking back. And so each night as the fire burned low and silence filled the room, words went unsaid. Yet the silence itself grew heavy with meaning. It was no longer the emptiness of strangers, nor the bitterness of resentment. It was a silence that held recognition, a shared knowledge of pain, of endurance, of being bound under one roof not by choice, but by necessity. Still, somewhere beneath it, unspoken and fragile, lived the faintest thread of something else, something that might one day break through. The day had worn long, the air heavy with a stillness that unsettled even the animals. Clara felt it first in the way the horizon darkened too quickly, clouds boiling black in the distance, stacking upon each other like mountains pressing down. Jonas worked outside, repairing a fence post with deliberate strikes of his hammer, but he glanced often toward the sky. The sound of hooves came before the rain. Clara's stomach tightened when 3 riders appeared at the edge of the yard, their hats pulled low, their horses restless. They dismounted slow, with the kind of swagger that carried menace in every gesture. Their eyes roamed too freely over the land, then over her. One of them spat into the dirt and asked about cattle, about boundaries, about whether Jonas truly owned this stretch of ground. Another, grinning with teeth yellow as old parchment, nodded toward Clara where she stood on the porch, shawl clutched, tight around her shoulders. "And who's the girl?" he asked, his tone sly, almost mocking. Jonas said nothing at first. He only shifted slightly, his broad frame filling the doorway, his right hand resting with casual certainty against the rifle prop there. His silence stretched long enough to make the men uneasy. When he finally spoke, his words were clipped. "Best be on your way, storm's coming." They exchanged glances, muttered something about unfriendly neighbors, and climbed back into their saddles. The sound of hooves faded into the vastness, but Clara's pulse did not settle. She could still feel their eyes on her, lingering like a bruise. By the time the storm broke, the sky was split with lightning. Rain slashed across the land in sheets, drumming against the roof, streaming down the windows in restless rivers. Jonas had already moved to the barn, and Clara, though fear prickled at her, followed. The air inside was damp and frantic with the cries of frightened livestock. Together they wrestled against wind and rain to secure the doors, to tie down what threatened to tear loose. In the chaos, as the gale tore at them, her fingers slipped on the rope. Jonas's hand closed over hers, steadying the knot. For a brief second in the wildness of the storm, the warmth of his hand lingered against her skin. It was nothing more than a passing touch, yet it burned into her like a brand, the kind that did not wound but steadied. They worked until the last gate was secured, their clothes soaked, hair plastered to their faces. Back inside, The fire sputtered, but held. Jonas handed her a tin cup filled with steaming coffee. The heat seeped into her frozen hands, the bitter scent grounding her in the moment. He studied her from across the firelight, his expression unreadable, then spoke with a quiet that cut through the roar of rain outside. "No one touches what's under my roof." The words hung there, simple yet heavy. Clara lowered her eyes, unsure how to answer, for no one had ever spoken them on her behalf. She had been given away, dismissed, treated as less than the worth of a cow or horse. Yet here, in this storm, beneath this roof, someone had drawn a line. She sat long into the night, the fire reflecting in her damp eyes, listening to the storm lash and howl. For the first time, she felt something shift within her, not the illusion of safety, but the raw seed of it. Not possession, not obligation, protection. The weeks that followed unfolded in a quiet rhythm, though beneath the stillness something heavier stirred. Each evening carried the same pattern. Jonas in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath his weight as the fire painted his profile in amber and shadow. Clara by the table, mending shirts, stitching seams, her head bent as the needle caught the lamplight. Silence stretched between them, not hostile but taut, as though words hovered near their lips yet never dared cross. His scarred knuckles tapped the arm of the chair, restless. Her tired eyes lingered on her work too long, betraying thoughts she would not voice. Ruth, untouched by the restraint of adults, filled the house with lighter sounds. She giggled when Clara braided her hair, when she helped pour flour into a bowl, when she nestled against her side during readings by lamplight. To the child, Clara was no stranger, but a root sunk deep into the soil of her small world. Jonas saw it, though he never said so. The way Ruth clung to her skirt, the way she smiled more freely now than she had in years. But beyond the walls of the cabin, voices whispered. Clara heard them in town when Jonas took her to fetch supplies. Words muttered too loudly, looks cast too long. A girl traded like livestock. A man who kept her out of pity, or worse. Her face burned with shame, though she had no fault in it, and each time she felt the weight of eyes, it hollowed her chest further. Even among the native families who lived along the ridges, whose friendship with Jonas was tentative at best, she saw suspicion, pity, the slow shake of a head that made her heart shrink. One evening, unable to bear the tightening coil in her chest, Clara wrapped her shawl tight and slipped outside. The prairie stretched vast and empty, the sun bleeding its last red light into the west. She walked toward the fence line, the wind tugging at her braid, her heart hammering as if each step were an act of defiance. She thought of leaving, of finding some corner of the earth where she would not be traded, not judged, not seen at all. Her hands gripped the fence rail, rough wood biting into her palms. She stood there trembling, her breath uneven, the horizon wide and cold before her. But her feet would not move. The emptiness ahead pressed as heavy as the whispers behind. Jonas's voice came low behind her, steady as the ground itself. Running won't heal what's been broken. She turned, startled, to see him a few steps away, his face shadowed by twilight, his eyes unreadable. He did not reach for her, did not demand. He simply stood, his words carrying the weight of a choice, staying might. The wind moved between them, lifting the edges of her shawl, carrying away the silence that had long stretched. She lowered her eyes, her grip on the fence loosening. She understood then what he had not said aloud, that he did not want her to go, that his house had held her not by force but by a hope he could not confess. To leave now would not only be to abandon him and Ruth, but to abandon herself. The prairie darkened around them, but for Clara, something steadier than fear began to take root. She stepped back from the fence, and though no promise passed her lips, she walked with him toward the cabin, the lamplight spilling warm across the threshold. The wind had turned sharp with autumn, carrying with it the brittle scent of dying grass and the promise of colder days. Nights grew longer, the cabin's fire burning lower as wood piles dwindled. They worked harder, shouldering the burden of the land together, yet unease lingered in the restless air. On a moonless night, when the prairie lay in darkness so complete it seemed endless, the cry of cattle broke through the silence. Then came the glow, flickering orange against the black sky. Flames had taken the barn. The fire rose fast, greedy, clawing at the dry timbers as if the earth itself sought to consume what little they possessed. Jonas ran first, his rifle forgotten, his voice hoarse as he shouted for Clara to hold the gate. He plunged into the smoke, driving panicked animals out into the yard. Clara followed, her shawl tight against her mouth, coughing against the bitter air. Sparks seared her arms as she tugged at ropes, unlatched stalls, and dragged a stubborn calf into the night. The fire roared around them, timber groaning under its own weight, the air hot enough to blister skin. Through the choking haze she saw Jonas stumble, his body buckling as smoke overwhelmed him. Fear struck her harder than the flames. She caught his arm, pulling with all the strength her thin frame could muster, dragging him into the open air as embers burned holes into the fabric of her shawl. He collapsed on the earth, coughing, and she fell beside him, her chest heaving with smoke. For a moment, the world was nothing but the sound of fire devouring wood, and their labored breaths tangled in the dark. Together they fought until the night wore thin, buckets of water, torn cloth, desperate shouts against the roar of destruction. By the time dawn stretched its pale fingers over the horizon, half the barn lay in ruin, charred beams still smoldering, smoke drifting like ghosts into the sky. Yet they were alive, both of them, ash clinging to their skin and clothes, lungs raw from the fight. The livestock huddled together in the yard, frightened but safe. Clara sat in the dirt, her body trembling, Jonas beside her. The fire had stripped away more than timber. It had burned through silence, through walls built out of grief and fear. He spoke first, his voice rough, still ragged from the smoke. I didn't want another woman in this house. I thought it'd mean betraying her, my wife. Thought I'd be taking what was never mine to take again. His gaze was fixed on the ashes, but his words reached her like a confession carved out of stone. Clara's throat tightened, her voice unsteady as she answered. I've never been wanted. Not once. Not by my father. Not by anyone. Her eyes stung, but it wasn't from the smoke. She wrapped her arms around herself as if to shield what had been laid bare. Being here, I keep waiting for the day you send me away. The silence that followed was not the same silence of months before. This one breathed between them, heavy with truth. Jonas turned his head at last, his eyes worn but clear, and without speaking, he reached for her hand. It was streaked with soot, blistered from rope and flame, yet he held it as if it were something fragile, worth guarding. They sat together in the gray light, Ruth asleep in the cabin, the land still scarred around them. The fire had taken much, but in its wake it had left something unexpected. For the first time, the quiet between them was not distance but closeness. In that stillness, something unspoken passed, neither promise nor possession, but the first breath of a bond freely chosen. The night they came again was colder, the kind of chill that pressed into bone. Jonas had been sharpening a blade by lamplight, the scrape of steel steady as a heartbeat. Clara was rocking Ruth near the hearth when hoofbeats broke the silence. Shadows loomed beyond the fence, voices carrying on the wind. Hard, unkind voices she remembered. The men dismounted, boots crunching on frosted earth. They called her name as though she were property, not flesh and blood. Jonas rose without. A word lifted the rifle from where it leaned against the wall and stepped outside. Clara followed to the doorway, heart pounding. Ruth's small fingers tangled in her skirt. The men stood bold, their hands near holsters, their eyes fixed on her. But Jonas moved between them, his back broad, his voice steady. She belongs to no man but herself, and no one takes from under my roof. Something in his tone stilled them more than the rifle. One spat in the dirt, another muttered a curse, but none stepped forward. His presence was enough. The standoff broke as suddenly as it had come, their horses' hooves fading into the night. Clara clutched the doorframe, knees weak, realizing she had been shielded not by force alone, but by the weight of Jonas's word. Yet fear lingered. Long after Ruth had fallen asleep, Clara moved through the cabin with restless steps. She felt the walls pressing in, the whispers from town, the shame her father had sown into her bones. Before dawn, she saddled the mare, her shawl wrapped tight, her hands trembling. The prairie stretched before her, endless, merciless, free. She could leave, vanish into horizon and silence. Jonas found her at the fence, reins slack in her hand. He did not shout nor demand. His voice was quiet, shaped by something deeper than anger. If you ride away, no one will stop you. But hear me, Clara. You were never something to be traded. You're a woman who stayed when you could have run. The word struck harder than thunder. She had stayed through storms, through fire, through the cruel judgment of strangers. She had chosen to mend torn shirts by lamplight, to teach Ruth little songs to pull a man twice her strength from burning beams. She had not stayed because she was bound, but because some part of her already belonged there. Her eyes burned as she turned to him, the wind tugging loose strands of her braid. Jonas stood steady, not pleading, not holding her captive, only waiting, offering truth like open ground. For the first time, she saw him not as a widower guarding a hollow house, but as a man willing to begin again, if she willed it to. Slowly, she let the reins slip from her hand. The horse snorted and settled, as though it had been holding its breath as well. Jonas reached out, not to take, but to steady, his hand brushing hers with the same quiet strength he had given her from the first night. When they rode back together, dawn stretched gold across the prairie. The ranch rose ahead, scarred from storms and fire, but standing. Smoke curled soft from the chimney, Ruth's small figure waiting in the doorway. The world behind them vast and unforgiving, yet the world before them no longer hollow. Clara drew in the sharp morning air and let it fill her lungs like a promise. It was not the home she had been born into, nor the one her father had sold her from, but the one she had chosen to return to. For the first time, she understood what that meant. Home was not shelter. Home was the fire that endured.